Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. It's time, once again, for another depressing dose of dismal Disney. On Sunday, September 8th, 2024, the New York Times released a very lengthy exposé about the very real battles that were occurring between Bob Iger and Bob Chapek within the very guarded corporate walls of the Walt Disney Company. And what this exposé clearly reveals is a very eye-opening perspective of just how controlling and egotistical Bob Iger truly is, as well as how much a total rubber stamp Disney's board of directors is in approving pretty much anything that Iger wants. Further, the exposé also reveals that while Bob Chapek may not have been the best choice to become Disney's CEO, Iger had essentially turned against Chapek very early on, and then began to countermand and even undermine Chapek as Disney board members began excluding him from meetings. And behind all of it was master manipulator Bob Iger. But before proceeding, I'd like to ask everyone to please like this video, please leave a comment, please subscribe to support this channel, and please press the bell to receive notifications. Thanks! The exposé in the New York Times is entitled "The Palace Coup at the Magic Kingdom," and the subtitle reads, "The Inside Story of How Bob Iger Undermined and Outmaneuvered Bob Chapek, His Chosen Successor, and Returned to Power at Disney." And because this is such a long exposé, I'm planning to break this up into more than one video, and this video is part 1. I will also say here that I highly doubt that any of the Hollywood trades would ever have written something like this, and certainly not the shill media websites, because this exposé paints such a negative picture of everything that was going on at the very top of the Walt Disney Company. But let's dig into the exposé. At 5 p.m. on February 25th, 2020, Bob Chapek and Bob Iger settled into matching director's chairs on the Disney studio lot for a series of live media interviews. The company had just shocked pretty much everybody by announcing that the little-known Chapek would be replacing the wildly popular Iger as chief executive. And while Iger may indeed be very popular in some circles, he's certainly not popular with everyone. The bald and stocky Bob Chapek and the graying but still debonair Bob Iger struck an immediate contrast, even though both were dressed in navy suits and open-collar white shirts and both were named Bob. In an interview with Julia Boorstin of CNBC, Chapek fawned over his predecessor. Quote, "I obviously have huge shoes to fill," unquote, he said with wide eyes, hailing Iger's quote-unquote magic running Disney. Iger's 15-year tenure as chief executive had been so successful that he had considered running for president as a Democrat. And Queen Elizabeth II had knighted him just before she died. Iger said that he and Chapek worked together quote-unquote extremely well, but in his very next breath he qualified that praise, quote, "Actually, our management team has worked together quite well," unquote. Chapek listened in vain for something more effusive, more personal. As the questions and the attention shifted entirely to Chapek, Iger's usually relaxed demeanor stiffened. His gaze shifted down, away from Chapek, and he looked increasingly uncomfortable. He crossed his arms. Chapek was intimately familiar with Iger's body language and expressions. It reminds me a lot of the movie The Devil Wears Prada.
They're showing a lot of florals right now, so I was thinking I could
Florals? For spring. Groundbreaking.
This is not good, he thought. And he was right about that. But little did he realize that he and Iger were about to face off in an epic corporate power struggle with little to rival it in business history. When Bob Iger stepped down as chief executive abruptly, just weeks before the coup had plunged Disney into the worst crisis in its history, the company's board agreed that he could stay on as creative director and executive chairman of the board for another 2 years. So from the onset, Iger was clearly uncomfortable with handing over control of the Disney company to Chapek, and Disney's board made the mistake of rubber stamping everything that Iger wanted, which included allowing him to retain control. Thus, the reality is that as long as Iger remained at Disney, he was the true source of power, not Bob Chapek, even though he had the title of CEO. But this next paragraph in the exposé shows just how tumultuous everything was even before Chapek was officially announced to be Disney's CEO. That agreement nearly fell apart over the issue of whom exactly Chapek would answer to, Iger or the board. And as far as I'm concerned, that's a huge red flag, and it's not the only one. From my own personal experience in a job that I once had, I was placed into a situation in which 3 different individuals, 2 of which were managers and the other a lead, were giving me contradictory instructions all at the same time. So I can empathize with the position that Chapek was initially being placed into, because when you don't really know who you're supposed to be answering to in a job, it creates enormous amounts of stress, especially when you're getting contradictory instructions regarding what your duties are supposed to be. And the fact of the matter is that it's an untenable and unsustainable situation, which in my case eventually contributed to my decision to quit that job not long thereafter because it wasn't going to improve. But let's move on with the exposé. A last-minute compromise reached without a board vote had Chapek reporting to both. And naturally, that proved to be a recipe for conflict as Chapek soon began to realize. And all of this was done to appease the very egotistical Bob Iger, and was quite possibly in violation of Disney's own bylaws. So just weeks into his tenure as chief executive, Chapek expressed frustration. Quote, "I can't survive another 2 years of this," unquote, Chapek told Arthur Bachner, his chief of staff. Iger is, quote, "not going to leave. He'll be here until he dies," unquote. Gee, I think that's how most people feel about Kathleen Kennedy at Lucasfilm at this point. Bachner worried that Chapek would quit, but Chapek was ultimately deprived of even that option when the board fired him just before Thanksgiving in 2022. And I had released a video about that at the time. So just as Chapek had feared, his successor was Iger. And as far as I'm concerned, quitting is exactly what Chapek should have done. So we'll skip down to this first subsection that's entitled The Snake Pit, which is only the first of 17 subsections, just to give you folks watching this video an idea regarding how long this exposé is. For a company that bills its theme parks as the quote-unquote happiest place on Earth, Disney's corporate headquarters has long been anything but a hotbed of intrigue and power struggles. Chapek's former chief of staff told people the company's 6th floor executive suite was a snake pit. Paraphrasing the next few paragraphs, several years before Iger made Chapek CEO in his place, he had given Chapek the impression that he didn't want Jay Rasulo or Tom Staggs to be his successors until in 2015 he named Tom Staggs the chief operating officer and his presumptive heir. But Iger very quickly soured on Staggs and pushed him out of the company in April of 2016, which was only 15 months later. Sound familiar? Let's chalk that up as a second red flag, showing Iger's demonstrable reluctance to give up control. Now more about Bob Chapek. He had started at Disney in 1993 in the VHS tape department and eventually rose to oversee all movie distribution. In 2011, he took over Disney's Consumer Products division, which soon became flush with frozen merchandise sales. By 2015, Chapek had been promoted to run theme parks, overseeing at least $24 billion in capital investments, including new Star Wars, Avengers, and Toy Story rides. Chapek was the consummate company man, loyal to Iger to the point of obsequiousness. Alone among Disney senior managers, he routinely called Iger boss rather than Bob, which Iger had found endearing. At the same time, Chapek lacked Iger's charisma and wasn't a natural communicator, and even Chapek acknowledged that he had low EQ or emotional intelligence. Iger urged him to work on his bedside manner. Then Iger told Chapek to schedule a series of one-on-one meetings with Disney's directors in order to build a rapport with them and to lay out his vision for the company's future. But in late 2017, Disney reached a deal to buy the entertainment assets of 21st Century Fox, for which Iger received a big bonus for consummating the deal, which included stock awards of up to $142 million at the then current share price. And then the board extended his contract for a 6th time. So as a result, Iger wouldn't retire until the end of 2021. And what did Chapek do? He canceled his plans to meet the directors. And I have to call this entire scenario a third red flag because it showed yet again that Iger didn't want to give up control. So the second subsection of this expose is entitled, Is There Life After Disney? A Disney chief executive is an instant celebrity that presides over what are perceived as some of the most powerful and glamorous businesses in the world. The Marvel, Disney, Pixar, Lucasfilm, and 20th Century Movie Studios, the ABC Broadcast Network and News Division, and cable channels like ESPN, FX, and National Geographic. Its 12 theme parks attracted a combined 142 million visitors in 2023. And even by chief executive standards, the pay is enormous. Forbes estimates Iger's net worth at over $700 million. With a yacht, a corporate jet, power, and influence, Bob Iger and his wife, Willow Bay, a former television anchor and the current dean of the University of Southern California's Journalism School, hobnobbed with a rarefied crowd: Barack and Michelle Obama, Jeff Bezos, Steven Spielberg, David Geffen, and Oprah Winfrey, just to name a few. Obviously, Iger's wealth, power, and influence is a fourth red flag because in regards to his willingness to give up power at Disney, did he also perceive that as giving up portions of his wealth and influence?
All who gain power are afraid to lose it.
In the next paragraphs, which I'll paraphrase, Iger didn't like all of his duties as CEO, such as earnings presentations, budget meetings, or being grilled by Wall Street analysts, but at the same time he complained about his compensation and wanted more. In other words, he wanted fewer responsibilities but with more money. He had also spoken with people like Steve Jobs, who, before his death in 2011, had urged Iger to step back and enjoy life. So in December of 2019, right at the onset of the coup, is when Iger broached Disney's board about finding his replacement, and he wanted Bob Chapek to succeed him. But he also wanted it to happen in what he described as being an accelerated process. Iger suggested that Chapek was his choice to succeed him. Iger told the board that Chapek knew the brand well, respected it, and would do no harm. He also said that Chapek had great integrity. One of Disney's directors, Mark Parker, had recently decided to step down as chief executive of Nike and become executive chairman. So Iger pitched doing the same thing. That model would allow him to stay at Disney for the remainder of his contract doing what he liked best, overseeing the company's creative endeavors. Chapek would become the CEO and handle everything else. In other words, Iger wanted to dump all of the work that he didn't want to do onto Chapek so that he could keep the fun and creative responsibilities to himself. A crucial element was that all of the division leaders would report to Chapek, but Chapek would report to Iger, leaving Iger ultimately in charge. Because Iger ultimately did not want to actually give up control, but Chapek was also not actually being set up to become a CEO. Chapek was being set up to become a middleman with limited authority under Iger's control. There was an obvious financial incentive as well. Iger still had more than $100 million in unvested stock options, and his leadership could help protect its value. So that adds weight to the fourth red flag, which is directly connected to the first red flag and which is also being referenced here. Chapek had to answer to Iger. But there actually was some opposition to what Iger wanted to do. Safra Catz, the chief executive of Oracle and a Disney board member, pushed back. Why make Chapek chief executive rather than chief operating officer? Iger said that he didn't want a rerun of the situation with Staggs, in which people thought Staggs was merely auditioning for the top job, and they could outmaneuver him by going directly to Iger. But in a rare show of resistance, the board was unpersuaded. It agreed to consider the issue over the holidays. But by the time board members met in late January of 2020 in Los Angeles, they had come around. So Iger told Chapek the good news immediately afterward, saying an announcement would be made in just 3 weeks on February 25th. In retrospect, none of this was good news for Chapek. Why the rush? Xenia Muka, Disney's chief communications officer and a close advisor to Iger, counseled delay. She disagreed with the entire plan, including the selection of Chapek, but Iger was adamant. Iger had his mind set, and once he makes up his mind about something, it's evident that he's a brick, which I'm sure is a long-time problem at Disney. By mid-February, the coup was spreading widely, and the pressure it could put on the company was becoming clear. Iger had received a detailed briefing in New York from the ABC News team covering the story, and Disney's theme parks in Shanghai and Hong Kong had already closed. Then David Jefferson, a Disney spokesman, said that the coup had nothing to do with the timing of the leadership change. Board members agreed, but when pressed, offered no explanation for the haste other than that was what Iger wanted. I personally don't think that the sudden leadership change was just purely coincidental to the onset of the coup. It's far more likely that the coup was the catalyst that pushed Iger into wanting to make this decision so that he couldn't be blamed for decisions that might go bad. Everything could be blamed on Chapek as the CEO. Going into the subsection named Don't Step on His Toes, several interesting things are mentioned. First, director Susan Arnold traveled personally to meet with Bob Chapek to assure him that he was the board's unanimous choice. But she also told him that he had no time to meet with other directors. While they had met with Chapek in his previous roles, the idea that there was no time or no need to interview him to assess his capacity to serve as chief executive, not to mention explore his vision for the future of a company in the midst of a profound change, seems inexplicable. This is a very obvious fifth red flag here because Iger was clearly rushing everything to the point that normal business processes could not occur, and yet the board had continued to rubber stamp everything that Iger wanted. This is the danger of blindly following and doing the bidding of a charismatic leader. But Susan Arnold wasn't done talking to Chapek. Arnold recognized that the unusual arrangement in which Iger would be staying on as executive chairman and chief creative officer posed a potential for conflict. She urged Chapek to show him deference. Give him a wide berth on creative matters, she advised. Don't step on his toes. In other words, what authority as CEO was Chapek actually going to have? From what I can see, not that much, given how beholden he was being set up to do Bob Iger's bidding. But I'd have to say that don't step on his toes is a sixth red flag unto itself because it separately represents how adversely impacted Chapek's authority was going to be in favor of Bob Iger. But there's yet another red flag coming up in the very next paragraph. Notably, Chapek would not be joining Disney's board, which was unusual given that nearly all chief executives also serve as board members and in many instances as chair. But the board wanted a probation period for Chapek and wanted to emphasize that he would be reporting to Iger. So it would be awkward if Chapek were also a member of the board responsible for Iger's oversight. This is where we see the total abdication of responsibility on the part of Disney's board of directors to make Iger happy and just be a mindless rubber stamp to his whims. So yes, Chapek not joining Disney's board after being told that he's becoming CEO is a huge seventh red flag since it was an atypical business practice. When shareholders voted against bringing Nelson Peltz onto Disney's board back in April, as I had talked about in a video that I had released at the time, they were more interested in appeasing Bob Iger than anything else, just like Disney's board of directors already had. which is why Iger was so adamant and spent tons of company money to convince shareholders to vote for his rubber stamping board. And what have shareholders gotten for themselves as a result? Disney stock is still below $90 a share as of the time that I am recording this video. In the days before the announcement, Iger told just a handful of top executives, among them Christine McCarthy, who was the chief financial officer. And like almost everyone who learned the news, she was taken aback. While pledging to help Chapek succeed, she pointed out some of his weaknesses. He knew next to nothing about the television business, he didn't know anything about sports programming, he didn't have many relationships with Hollywood talent, and he hadn't dealt with Wall Street. Iger agreed that Chapek didn't come across as especially creative. But Iger had faced the same criticism when he was named president of ABC Entertainment in 1989. "I think he can do it," Iger insisted, "and I'll still be around." Was Iger just trying to set up Bob Chapek to become a scapegoat if anything went wrong? If board members had legitimate concerns about Chapek's qualifications to become CEO, Iger wasn't interested in hearing them, which certainly comes across as Iger possibly just wanting to set up Chapek to become a scapegoat. In other words, Iger may have just been using Chapek, because that's what this looks like. And the board's blind rubber stamping allegiance to Bob Iger ultimately prevailed, which any reasonable person might think should be concerning to Disney shareholders, but a clear majority of them also blindly support Iger and his rubber stamping board. A loud exception was Nelson Peltz, who wanted to join Disney's board to ensure that his and other shareholders' concerns were actually being heard. But in response, Iger spent a ton of Disney's money to convince shareholders to support his rubber stamping board, and that's what Iger got to his glee. The subsection called A Last Minute Hitch talks about how on February 24th, the arrangement to make Chapek CEO and answerable to Iger nearly collapsed when Alan Braverman, Disney's long-serving general counsel, called Iger to say that under the company's bylaws, the chief executive has to report to the board, not to Iger. But for Iger, that was a non-starter because he wanted to retain ultimate control. In other words, Disney's own bylaws didn't matter to Iger then, and I doubt that they do today either. So it was Braverman and Zenia Muka who came up with a hastily conceived compromise. Chapek would report to both the board and to Iger. And that was just an incredibly stupid idea. But that was okay with Iger since from his perspective, Chapek would still report to him. And that was truly all that mattered to him because Iger then insisted that the announcement about the leadership change be made the next morning as scheduled, even though board members hadn't discussed it as a group, let alone approved the new dual reporting arrangement.
I am the Senate.
This, of course, is just another huge red flag, the 8th one now. The board of directors should have at least been given an opportunity to discuss the matter, but everyone there just bowed to the whims of egotistical Bob Iger and ultimately rubber-stamped what he wanted again. Does this attitude help explain why Disney is in such poor financial shape nowadays? But guess what? No one had actually told Chapek about the change to the reporting structure. But he wasn't apparently concerned about it because in his mind, Iger had always been such a strong supporter of his. And this was a huge red flag for Chapek, the 9th one, his blind trust in Bob Iger that contributed to his personal downfall. George Lucas trusted Iger too, and now the Star Wars franchise that he created is essentially dead today as a result. And just to emphasize who was truly in charge, Iger decided to stay in the office that both he and Michael Eisner had occupied as chief executives. Chapek was relegated to smaller quarters nearby, and the arrangement only added to internal confusion about Chapek's new status. When there's no clear leadership, it's going to be confusing for everyone, and that is what Disney's rubber stamping board of directors created by bowing to Iger's whims. Bob Iger manipulated this entire scenario that would eventually prove to be incredibly costly to the Walt Disney Company to preserve his personal sense of unlimited power over the company. And with that, I'll end part 1 and plan on starting the next video in this series with the next subsection that's entitled Iger's Lapdog. Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to everyone who has subscribed to our channel. We appreciate your support. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button, and please feel free to share a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, please press the red subscribe button, and please press the bell to receive notifications for new content. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and Twitter by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.